I have received your letter together with the bottle of urine. Thus starts a letter written by the medical practitioner and alchemist Leonhard Thurneisser, sent to the family of a young noblewoman. The family had consulted Thurneisser by letter, describing the young woman's symptoms. She menstruates too frequently, with dark discharge, accompanied by fainting spells, and when she comes to, she makes rather unsettling predictions that often turn out to come true. Other practitioners had already been consulted, and they saw this as a sign of possession. The family had evidently also sent along a bottle of urine for Thurneisser to examine for clues about the young woman's health. This was, of course, perfectly normal at the time. The inspection of urine or uroscopy was a staple of the physician's trade, and they often consulted by letter. Thurneisser starts by doing what any physician would do: examine the urine's appearance. He states that it looks healthy for one of her age, as far as the substance and the color are concerned. A traditionally trained physician would perhaps proceed to smell or even taste the urine, but not do much more than that. This is where Thurneisser deviates dramatically from the established practice. He writes, "In this new art and invention, we do not think much of outer appearance alone, so we move on to practice and proof." This practice and proof, or Probe in German, is Thurneisser's invention, or so he claims. The Harnprobe, that is to say, the analysis of urine by distillation. First of all, he weighs the urine, 16 lot, 2 quintlines, and a third of a dram, since you asked. And according to Thurneisser, this indicates a well-tempered complexion, as far as the weight can reveal anything. But then he proceeds to distill the urine in a flask of his own design with 24 graduations that map onto different areas of the human body, as you can see here in my first image. During the distillation, he observes how different fractions corresponding to the elements distill off. He observes that the aerial fraction does not behave as expected. Next slide. He says the fumes are forced back down and creeps under the earth and forces the fire to rise in the upper part of the helmet, which to us signifies the head with all its delicate senses. So what happens in the head or helmet of the flask indicates what is going on inside the head of the patient. As Thurneisser distills further, and this is the second quotation on the slide here, the entire helmet is filled with a thick steam, mist, and muck-colored fumes, which are somewhat blue in color, and with yellow-green bands mixed through, truly a poisoning, which must be of a cruel, cold, and aconitic nature. So the distillation tells Thurneisser not just the location, but also the material process that is happening in the body. In this case, the color and behavior of the vapors indicate a disease caused by pathological matter of a cold nature, similar to the poison of aconite or wolfsbane. Thurneisser explains that this poison numbs the patient's reason and senses, which explains her fainting spells and her psychological symptoms. He is not surprised that other practitioners thought this was due to demonic possession. That's what you would assume if you simply inspect the urine, which looks healthy to the naked eye, and only Thurneisser's distillation reveals the true, natural cause. He makes a number of further observations based on his distillation and then closes with a regimen for the patient and sends along the medicines that she should take. This is one of over 100 urine analyses, or Harnproben, of Thurneisser's that survive. This includes drafts and copies of letters held at the Staatsbibliothek here in Berlin, among Thurneisser's other papers. And 12 of these Harnproben Thurneisser actually published in his 1571 Pro Catalepsis. And the example I just gave you is actually one of these published cases. I'm interested in these records of a remarkable technique as part of a bigger project on the history of distillation. This is very much work in progress. I'm still at the beginning of exploring these, and I'm just sharing here a few initial observations, and I look forward to your comments. This is the plan for today. I'll give you a little bit of background on Thurneisser, his life, the intellectual traditions, that shaped his thinking on urine distillation, such as uroscopy and the idea of the Homo alembicus, the human body as an alembic. And I then turned to the Harnproben themselves, to his reports of urine distillation, to show what kind of a body emerges from these fascinating documents. I will show that we can see the body understood in terms of matter and its movement. We see a very dynamic and also a temporal, a time-bound body, and finally a proportioned body in the images as well as in the distillation. And then finally, by way of a conclusion, I reflect on the kind of expertise that this practice spells out for Thurneisser. First, a little bit of background. Who was Leonhard Thurneisser? He was born in 1531 in Basel as the son of a goldsmith. He had little to no formal schooling, but expertise in mining and medicine. He learns about pharmacy and the new Paracelsian chemical medicine as a famulus to the Basel professor of medicine Johann Huber. Thurneisser has to leave Basel after he tries to pay his debts with fraudulent gold, so there is more than a whiff of the showman and the charlatan about him, although this tends to get exaggerated in the historiography. Another thing that is often foregrounded is the fact that he also got married and rather spectacularly and disastrously divorced more than once. After Basel, he becomes something of an itinerant expert in mining and metallurgy. In the 1560s, he is employed in this capacity by Archduke Ferdinand II of Tyrol, who sends him traveling again to learn more about mining. This takes Thurneisser to Scotland and the Orkneys, to Spain, Portugal, North Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, some Arab countries, Palestine, Syria, Italy, and Hungary. That is, if we believe what he says. From 1969 to 70, he spent a brief spell in Münster as personal physician to the bishop. And in 1571, he became the personal physician to Johann Georg, the elector of the Brandenburg court. And his calling card for this position was the successful performance of a urine distillation and analysis for the elector's wife. Thurneisser was allowed to set up shop in the Graues Kloster in the Grey Cloister here in Berlin, where he set up his own print shop, as well as laboratory and workshop. He also directed the establishment of the glassworks at Burg Grimnitz and established the first Wunderkammer, or curiosity cabinet, in Brandenburg, as well as a botanic garden. After Berlin, he moves to Basel to his third disastrous marriage, where he loses much of his property. He then, in the 80s, moves back to Berlin for a while before he leaves in 1584 and becomes Catholic. He goes on to live in Rome, Switzerland, and Germany, and dies in Cologne in 1596. These are some of his publications. We see that he had a variety of interests, including chemistry, alchemy, medicine, and he was influenced by Paracelsus and iatrochemistry. And I suspect that for this audience, I don't need to say too much about who Paracelsus was and the kind of chemical medicine that he and his followers developed. We will, of course, have occasion to touch on it as we discuss Thurneisser. Unlike Paracelsus, Thurneisser was not against all medical learning. Like other, slightly more conciliatory chemical practitioners, he thought that Galen was wrong in some things, but that Hippocrates, the other ancient father of medicine, was mostly right. He was just misunderstood by later learned exegetes. Thurneisser does take issue with the humoral medicine of his day, the contemporary Galenists, or humorists as he calls them, who have criticized his new methods. He in turn accuses them of being ignorant, of prescribing adulterated or fanciful remedies, and you can perhaps get an idea of his stance on Galenic medicine by what he writes about this technique shown here in an image from the surgeon Fabry van Hilden. This is a hair rope that is inserted under the skin to promote the formation of pus, and this is supposed to evacuate bad humors. Thurneisser calls this the 13th article of faith of the Galenists, and this is what he has to say about it. If I were allowed just 15 minutes fiddling with such a hair rope on this kind of healer, I would cure him of his itch to use such a seesaw on someone else's neck ever again. So as you can see, he is dying to use what he thinks as rather a crude medical intervention on those Galenic physicians who criticize him. He is rather outspoken in his criticism of medical orthodoxy, albeit less so than Paracelsus, and he uses his urine analysis to point out his distractors' mistakes, as we have seen in the initial example that I gave. So what did the cosmos look like according to Thurneisser? What was the material world and the human's place in it as he understood it? Thurneisser follows Paracelsus in criticizing Aristotelian matter theory based on the four elements. He thought that the Paracelsian tria prima, mercury, salt, sulfur, and salt, play an important part in the substance and generation of matter, but not as foundational a part as we see in Paracelsus's writings. Often Thurneisser rather seems to follow Cardano more than Paracelsus, especially in his arguments that there are only three elements, because fire doesn't count, as it's an accident and not a principle of matter. Accordingly, then, there are only three humours: black bile, phlegm, and blood. And again here, distillation is the key to these arguments. Both Cardano and Thurneisser claim that distillation yields 3 fractions, not 4, which of course Hippocrates and Galen didn't realize because this new technique was not then invented. Thurneisser loves to arrange principles and forces of nature in triads, but they just as often include the 3 remaining elements, earth, water, and air, as the Paracelsian tria prima, and they mesh these with other groups of 3, such as the celestial, the spiritual, and the natural, the soul, the spirit, and the body, or the vital, animal, and natural spirits that can be found within the body. He is sometimes inconsistent. For example, he denies that fire is an element because you can't see it in distillation, but in his urine distillations, he then sometimes describes a fiery fraction. There may be a development across his career that he changed his mind at some point, but I have yet to tease that out. All this already hints at the correspondence between the macrocosm of the universe and the microcosm of the human body that is central to Paracelsian and iatrochemical thought. This was a layered analogy. For Paracelsus and Thurneisser, the human body could be understood in terms of the motions of the planets. But since both of these figures were socialized around mining and metalwork, they also understood the body in analogy with a mine, governed by mineral deposits and fumes. So to be a doctor, one really had to understand these material transformations. With this kind of internal alchemy going on inside the body was then also understood to work like a distilling alembic. This idea of the homo alembicus, so that the body was itself a kind of distillation vessel, does not originate with Paracelsus or Thurneisser. It has its origins in the medical writings of Avicenna in the Middle Ages, and we can see it developing in the new printed genre of the Destillierbücher, or books of distillation, that became popular in the early 16th century. Here's an example, the Kräuterbuch, or Herbal, by the physician Adam Lohnitzer. He writes here, "The pan or the vat of the stomach is heated by the hearth of the liver, and the inner vapors rise into the head and skull as an alembic, and through its coldness are driven together to snot or phlegm into the nose, as the beak of the alembic and the neck, whence they fall back again and must be swept out by sniffling, coughing, and clearing of the throat." In other words, fumes rise, condense, and are expelled inside the body just as they are in a distilling alembic. The next step was to move from this idea of the homo alembicus, of the distilling body, if you like, to the diagnostic distillation of urine. And this was born from the intersection with another older medical tradition, the practice of uroscopy or medical diagnosis from urine, that I already touched upon earlier. This also goes back at least to the Middle Ages. Many of you have probably seen a uroscopy chart like this one on the left, which illustrates how a physician could judge an imbalance of the 4 humors from sediments in the urine, its color, smell, and even its taste. Paracelsus and his followers developed this idea according to their own view of the body. Its internal alchemy left traces in the urine that could only be recovered by chemical means, such as distillation. Thurneisser took this idea and developed it into a refined diagnostic technique, or an art as he calls it. He develops a system of distilling different fractions corresponding to the elements and observes exactly how they behave. His key invention, as he calls it, was this special alembic that was divided into 24 zones corresponding to different parts of the body. This too had antecedents in traditional uroscopy. The glass macula used for urine inspection had a characteristic shape, and some importance was attached to whether suspended particles could be seen at the top, middle, or were floating around the bottom. In the 14th century text De Orinis by Actuarius, we already see this division of the macula into 12 different zones that corresponded to parts of the body. Thurneisser subdivides this further into 24 zones, providing an even more precise correspondence between the flask and the human body, as you can see here. By using distillation to analyze urine as the product of the body's own internal distillation, Thurneisser makes this analogy between the alembic and the body very tight and very real, to the point where it's perhaps more than an analogy. This later image on the right here, from a Paracelsian publication, is almost certainly a response to Thurneisser, perhaps even a satirical one, as Ute Fritzsch has suggested. It certainly seems to play with the idea that the body is in fact a distillation flask by putting an alembic on the real human figure's head. Now that we have an idea of the traditions that shaped Thurneisser's practice, I want to turn to his urine analyses, or Harnproben, in more detail. This, as I said, is work in progress. This is still the beginning of an archival journey through hundreds of records of these in Thurneisser's papers. So I'm just sharing some preliminary observations here on disease as a local and a material phenomenon, on disease and emotions as movements of matter, and on disease as a dynamic process that unfolds in time, and finally on proportions of distilling bodies and the alembic. This is what Thurneisser observes while distilling the urine of a 46-year-old woman. A blue, yellow, and green vapor, smoke, steam, and mist at the location of the womb that first showed in the middle of the flask, which must be the place of such infected things, for these colors, yellow, green, and blue, indicate nothing other than putrefaction. So the color of the vapors indicates putrefaction, and they hover around the middle of the flask, which corresponds to the location of the womb in the female body. So what's happening in the flask maps onto what's happening inside the body. The distillation really provides a map of bodily phenomena. And Thurneisser visualizes this in his publications, where he maps different vapors, as is shown here, or mineral deposits inside figures of human bodies, scaled to correspond to the zones of the alembic. This figure here is kind of strangely elongated, and I will come back towards the end to this question about those images. Thurneisser's Harnproben also show that he thinks of disease as a material phenomenon. The same report on the 46-year-old woman continues. The fumes attach to the liver, lung, and heart, and as they are dried out by the internal vital heat, they form a tartar, which covers the internal conduits, just as wine scale attaches to the bottom of a barrel. Tartar or coagulated matter which you may see with your own eyes in the little box marked A. So this shows, Thurneisser explains the disease with the formation of concrete mineral substances that could also be found outside the body, for example in a wine barrel. This shows the influence of Paracelsus again, who formulated a whole raft of tartaric diseases. But Thurneisser makes the analogy very concrete. The formation of a mineral deposit in the alembic is not only a sign of an analogous deposit in the body, it is the same chemical phenomenon, whether it happens in the distilling urine, in the body, or in the wine barrel. And sometimes, as I already read to you in the second quotation, he even sends a physical sample of the peccant substance. In this case, he refers to this tartar or coagulated matter, which he sends along with his letter in a little box marked with the letter A, just to show the patient with their own eyes what they are dealing with in terms of the materials that are causing pathologies inside their bodies. Thurneisser pays attention not just to the presence of matter, but also to its appropriate movements through the body, the up and down of distilling vapors, and how that may interfere with other moving parts in the body. For example, here he describes how, when all dwelling places of the vital spirits are filled and stopped up with such rising fumes, the spirits cannot pass through, such that memory cannot reach the senses, reason cannot get through to the passions of the heart. So the rising fumes that he sees in his distillation of the patient's urine block the passages of the vital spirits that mediate between sense perception, memory, reason, and the passions, that is to say, the emotions. They may even cut off consciousness altogether and cause the patient to faint. Thurneisser often describes especially the emotions in terms of moving matter inside the body. And as Olinka Rublek and Michael Stolberg have shown, ordinary people without medical training often express their experience of diseases and embodied emotions in terms of fluxes that move around the body. And one of my questions is to explore the role distillation and especially Thurneisser played in shaping this popular paradigm of a fluid body. I'm also very interested in exploring how this idea, fluid bodies, distilling bodies, shaped imaginaries of mechanical or hydraulic bodies in the 17th century, of course, with Descartes' famous picture of a reflex here that is produced entirely mechanically. Thurneisser's explanations sometimes do sound very mechanical. For example, he talks about vapors and fluxes in the head being diverted if one leans forward too much for reading or writing purposes, so that the angle of the head changes the way matter moves inside the body. By paying attention to movement, of course, distillation affords a very dynamic view of disease. Thurneisser writes, "These vapors also rise all the way up to the helmet and refuse to resolve into water. They remain misty like a fog and over time become thicker, more turgid, a mass like a round sphere, and furiously move back and forth, which shows that a part of these vapors penetrate the inner air passages of the liver, lung, and heart, causing weakness and putrefaction." So whereas in a traditional uroscopy, we would only get a snapshot of the state of the body at a certain time by just looking at the urine. In the distillation flask, Thurneisser sees an entire pathogenic material process playing out in front of his eyes. So his technique yields not only a map of the body, but really something more like an animated weather map that shows a sped up version of clouds and winds moving across with an area of low pressure coming in from the Netherlands and so on. That's more how I imagine this as a map, a very dynamic depiction. I think that this temporal dimension of the distillation process yields explanatory power. For example, it allows Thurneisser to explain why certain symptoms change over time. It also allows him to explain recurring or cyclical symptoms. For example, there is one case where the patient faints periodically. In fact, it is is the case that I showed in the previous slide, and Thurneisser explains that these bad vapors that rise into the passages of the brain and heart and prevent proper communication of the vital spirit cause fainting because they cut off consciousness altogether. But when these vapors condense as they cool down, they take up less space, so the vital spirits can return and the patients revive, which then sets off another cycle. So he can explain these cyclical sort of phenomena. Distillation also allows him to look into the past, the present, and the future of the disease and, for example, make a prognosis. In one case, he finds white grainy matter in his distillation, which signifies that the patient, although currently healthy, will suffer from gout in the future. And this is really part of a larger question about alchemy, and especially about distillation, as a way of intervening in the course of time. This connects to Thurneisser's interest in astrology, which is all about how to live with time and in time. We can see this, for example, in this very elaborate astrolabe that he printed and published as part of one of his publications. So you can cut out and paste onto strong cardboard all of these different parts of, and then you have a moving paper astrolabe. And the good people of the Library of Congress have done this for us here to show how it can be assembled. And if we zoom in on the kind of ground plate of this astrolabe, we see that it describes the circle of the year with the zodiac and the months, but it's also titled Das Menschenzirkel und Lauf, so the circle and course of human life. So it's also symbolic of the entire life course of a human being. And around the edges of this human life, or this year, this temporal cycle, we have all these instances of chemical, alchemical preparations, including distillation, suggesting perhaps that distillation is a powerful way of intervening in time. For example, by preserving the healing powers of medicinal herbs that are only in season during certain times, but also by preserving the human body itself against premature age and decay. Thurneisser's body alembic analogy is characterized by an obsession with proportion. He states that the analysis, as he describes it to his readers, only works with bodies that are well proportioned, and that means that their height corresponds to 7 times the height of their head. He writes, "This proportion shall be understood to apply in all our teaching, lest through a misunderstanding about the size, a mistake should be made about the rising of vapors and fumes or about depositions of tartaric matter." So everything he writes applies only to this normal proportion of 7 heads, and if the patient differs from this proportion, the practitioner has to adjust their translation from the graduated flux to the patient's body, and this is what he explains in this second quotation. "We mention these measurements so the doctor, if the person be taller or shorter, may know to add or subtract the rising clouds, for the external proportion of the body shows the arrangement of the inner parts. Other variables of the body matter a lot less. The overall size, skin color, shape of the nose, all things that traditional Galenists would normally take into account, Thurneisser says doesn't matter so much so long as the correct proportions are observed." To explain his ideas about proportion, and as a kind of precursor to introducing his graduated alembic, Thurneisser introduces this yardstick or measuring stick with the same graduation. Although it is not entirely clear how you would use this in practice, it may just be a kind of thought experiment that shows his thinking about proportion. Thurneisser gets his obsession with proportion, at least in part, from reading Vitruvius, but he also mentions painters, including Michelangelo, Dürer, Martin van Heemskerk, and Frans Flores. He claims that he knew many of them personally and that he himself studied with Flores. Thurneisser makes much of his skill as a draftsman, and he did produce some very impressive printed images, as we have seen with the astrolabe, many of them in his own print shop at the Brandenburg court. So far, I haven't really analyzed the images in a lot of detail that does them justice, really. So I just want to return to these strangely elongated figures that Thurneisser uses to map the locations of different vapors and deposits in the body. If he thinks proportion is so important, why this long, thin body, which is actually 8 heads tall, according to his own numbered scale, if you do the maths? This is something I'm still figuring out, but one explanation could be that it simply saves space on the page. You can put many of these next to each other, and he sometimes does this. Thurneisser himself says that these images are stretched vertically because they follow the proportion of the flask, which are stretched vertically themselves because the vapors rise up during distillation. I'm not quite sure what to make of this yet, but it's an intriguing thought that the distillation process itself literally distorts the image of the body. And there is some precedent for this in the literature on distillation, especially the Destillierbuch by Walter Hermann Riff. Riff thinks a lot about the proportions of distilling apparatus. For example, he writes that one needs flasks with different proportions because some substances rise up more readily than others. So he suggests that these proportions have a material effect on the distillation. So whichever, depending on which flask you use here, with different proportions of height to width, you will get a different result in the distillation. Roeff is interesting because he also published an edition of Vitruvius, so he likely had a similar sort of perspective on proportions to Thurneisser's, but this is something I still need to explore. To sum up so far, what kind of bodies have we seen in Thurneisser's distillations? We've seen material bodies, bodies that are in flux, bodies that exist and can be manipulated in time, and proportioned bodies in images and maps of bodies. Sort of by way of a conclusion, I want to just finish by exploring what Thurneisser's expertise looks like if we look at it through the lens of his distillation practice. It is first of all a visual expertise. As I said, he makes much of his draftsmanship, and we've just seen that he thinks a lot about proportionality and about making images. And of course, there's his own impressive visual practice in his printed publications, which still have some puzzles to offer. His experience is also an artisanal and material expertise that comes from his experience in mining and metallurgy, his experience with alchemy, so really an expertise of materials and of processes. He also spells out a sensory expertise. Distillation functions as a powerful extension of the human senses, which are, of course, fallible. Traditional uroscopy, as Thurneisser never ceases to tell us, relied on inspection by sight alone, or sometimes smell and taste, and this was apt to miss important material changes and components in the patient's urine. These kinds of invisible spiritus and other subtle matter could be made visible through distillation. For example, as we have seen, the apparently healthy urine of a patient could show signs of sickness during distillation. Thurneisser cites the case of a 50-year-old man where the color of and weight of the urine indicate that the patient is healthy, but actually in the distillation he reveals that there are three very grave kinds of diseased matter that have penetrated practically his entire body. The distillation could also reveal a poison that would otherwise be missed, and we saw that in the example I quoted at the beginning, where the urine of the young noblewoman looked healthy, and only the distillation revealed the presence of a poisonous matter that had been missed by previous practitioners who had misdiagnosed her as possessed. So Thurneisser here really is the expert of the material rather than the spiritual cause. All this in turn affords an understanding and even a powerful visual imaginary of the otherwise invisible internal body. Thurneisser develops the Paracelsian idea of distillation as a sort of chemical anatomy of the body. He claims that, and I quote, "If you were to anatomize and cut up the body, you could not explore the division of the internal parts any better than through his urine distillation." So the Harnprobe is a new kind of chemical semiology. He is a new kind of semiological expert, if you like. It uncovers new signs with new meanings, and those are material signs that indicate underlying material causes. Here are some research questions that I would like to explore. So in closing, I will just tell you a little bit about those. I'm very interested in distillation as an epistemic technology of the body. As I said, I'm interested in exploring the relationship between fluid bodies, distilling bodies, and the later understanding of mechanical bodies. I want to explore more how distillation generates new images and new understandings of the body in the 16th century and beyond. And something I haven't touched on today at all is the patient's perspective. And this just requires a little bit more of combing through Thurneisser's letters and papers to see if perhaps there are any replies to Thurneisser's letters or the letters that describe a patient's ailments in the first place when, for example, they send a bottle of urine for analysis, just to see the difference between Thurneisser, the expert as he presents himself in these Harnproben that we've seen today, and the voice of the patients as they experience and describe their bodies. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I think we've come in just under time. Thank you.